He wasn't supposed to matter, just another stray in a city that had learned to look away, but sometimes the smallest shadows carry the loudest cries. Officer Emily Carter first noticed him at the edge of Maple and 7th, just past a flickering street lamp that buzzed like it was too tired to keep going. A small German Shepherd puppy with dusty fur and paws too big for his body, standing still in the drifting chill of late afternoon, watching her like he had been waiting longer than a dog that young should know how to wait. She kept walking. That was the job. You don't stop for every stray. Not when the radio keeps murmuring in your ear and the streets keep asking for more than you can give. Her boots hit the pavement in steady rhythm, the weight of her duty belt pulling at her hips, the cold air brushing against her face with that sharp edge that comes just before evening settles in. But then she heard it. Not a bark, not a whine, just the faint, uneven tapping of small paws behind her. She turned. He was there again. Same distance. Same quiet stare. Hey, she muttered under her breath, more to herself than to him, giving a small wave of her hand as if he might understand. Go on. Shoo. The puppy didn't move. His ears twitched slightly, one standing straighter than the other, his amber eyes fixed on her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had started to slip. Emily sighed, the kind that came from long shifts and too many things left unresolved, and turned back down the sidewalk. The city stretched around her in muted tones, brick buildings worn by time, storefront windows reflecting a sky slowly losing its color, the distant hum of traffic blending into a low, constant murmur. She walked half a block before she felt it again, that quiet presence trailing her steps. This time, she didn't turn right away. She let it follow, counting the seconds in her head, listening to the faint rhythm of those tiny paws trying to match her stride. 10 seconds. 20. 30. When she finally glanced back over her shoulder, he was closer now, just a few yards behind, his small chest rising and falling a little faster, like he was afraid she might disappear if he didn't keep up. You gotta be kidding me, she said softly, stopping this time. The puppy froze too, as if unsure whether he had crossed some invisible line. For a moment, the two of them just stood there, caught in the stillness between passing cars and distant sirens. Then Emily noticed something she hadn't before. His front paw lifted slightly off the ground, not fully, just enough to suggest something wasn't right. There was a faint smudge along his leg, something darker than the dust coating the rest of him. Not fresh, not obvious, but enough to make her brow tighten. What happened to you, huh? She asked, crouching just a little, her voice lowering without thinking, the way it always did when something fragile entered her space. The puppy didn't run. He didn't back away. Instead, he took a hesitant step forward, then another, closing the distance until he was just out of reach, his nose twitching, his eyes searching hers with a kind of urgency that didn't belong to something so small. Emily extended her hand slowly, palm down, letting him decide. He leaned forward, sniffed once, then pulled back, not in fear, but in impatience. And then, almost as if remembering something more important than her, he turned his head toward the narrow side street beside them. He looked back at her, then again toward the alley, then back at her. It wasn't random. It wasn't curiosity. It was direction. Emily felt it then, a subtle shift in the air, like the moment before a storm when everything goes just a little too quiet. The puppy took a few steps toward the alley, then stopped and looked back again, waiting, not begging, not wandering, waiting. And for the first time that day, Officer Emily Carter hesitated, her instincts pulling her in two directions at once, the trained voice in her head telling her to stay en route, to keep moving, to let someone else handle it, while something deeper, quieter, something she couldn't quite name, whispered that this wasn't just a stray looking for food. This was something else, something asking to be seen. Emily exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carried hesitation in it, and straightened just enough to look down the empty stretch of the alley the puppy kept glancing toward, a narrow passage between two aging brick buildings where daylight struggled to reach and the air seemed to settle heavier, holding onto the scent of damp concrete and forgotten things. And for a moment she said nothing, just listened, because sometimes silence told you more than noise ever could, and in that silence there was something faint, almost too soft to notice, a distant, uneven sound like something shifting or breathing somewhere out of sight, not loud enough to alarm, but just enough to feel wrong in a place that should have been empty. "All right," she murmured, more to herself than to him, her voice low and cautious, and she took one step toward the alley before stopping again, her training brushing up against instinct, reminding her of protocols, of staying visible, of not wandering into blind spots alone. But then she looked back at the puppy, and he was already moving, trotting a few steps ahead before pausing, checking to see if she was still there, his small body tense with purpose, not fear, and that was the part that settled it for her, because fear made animals run, but this one was leading. Emily adjusted her radio slightly on her shoulder, the soft crackle of static grounding her in routine, and stepped into the alley, her boots echoing faintly against the narrow walls as the light shifted around her, cooler now, dimmer, the sounds of the street fading behind her like a door slowly closing. And with each step the puppy kept just a few feet ahead, never too far, never too close, always looking back, guiding without making a sound. "Easy," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the space, taking in every detail the way she had been trained to do. The scattered cardboard boxes pushed against the walls, the rusted dumpster near the far end, the thin trail of water trickling along the cracked pavement. And then she saw it, faint at first, a pattern that did not belong to the randomness of trash and debris, small paw prints pressed into the damp surface, uneven, circling, leading deeper in, and beside them, lighter marks, as if something had been dragged or shifted slowly over time, not recently, but not long ago either. Her brow tightened, her focus sharpening as the pieces began to settle into place, not fully clear yet, but enough to feel the weight of something hidden just out of reach. The puppy stopped suddenly near a stack of wooden pallets leaned against the wall, his body stiffening as he turned back toward her, his ears twitching again, that same urgency in his eyes, only stronger now, almost pleading, and this time he let out a sound, not quite a bark, more like a soft, strained whimper that seemed to catch in his throat as if he was not used to making it, and it echoed faintly in the confined space, bouncing off brick and metal in a way that made it linger longer than it should have. Emily felt something tighten in her chest at that sound, something instinctive, human, and she moved closer, slower now, more deliberate, her hand hovering near her belt out of habit, not from fear, but from awareness, and she crouched again beside the pallets, her gaze shifting to the narrow gap behind them where shadows pooled thick and unmoving. "You want me to look in there?" she asked softly, her voice almost a whisper now, and the puppy responded not with another sound, but with movement, stepping closer to the gap, lowering his head, his nose brushing the edge of the wood before he looked back at her one more time, waiting, trusting, and that trust carried a weight Emily could not ignore, not anymore. She reached out, fingers curling around the rough edge of the top pallet, the wood cool and slightly damp beneath her grip, and for a brief second she paused, listening again, feeling the quiet press in around her, and then she pulled, just enough to shift the stack aside, creating a narrow opening where there had been none, and as the space widened, the air changed, subtle but unmistakable, carrying with it a warmth that did not belong to the cold alley, a faint rhythm beneath it, slow and uneven, like something holding on. Emily leaned closer, her eyes adjusting to the dimness beyond the pallets, her breath catching just slightly as the shape in the shadows began to take form, not fully clear yet, but enough to tell her one thing with certainty: the puppy had not been wandering, and whatever waited in that hidden space had been waiting for someone to finally follow. The space behind the pallets did not reveal itself all at once. It unfolded slowly as Emily's eyes adjusted to the dim light. Shapes separating from shadow, edges forming where there had only been darkness before, and then she saw her, a full-grown German shepherd lying curled against the cold concrete, her body thin but still, her chest rising and falling in shallow, careful breaths as if each one required effort she could barely afford, her fur dulled by dust and time, yet still carrying that faint pattern of sable beneath it. And for a second Emily did not move. She simply took it in, the quiet weight of the moment pressing against her ribs, the realization settling deep that this was what the puppy had been trying to show her all along. Hey there," she whispered, her voice instinctively softening, careful not to startle what was already fragile, and the mother dog's ears twitched at the sound, just slightly, not lifting fully, but enough to show she was aware, enough to show she had not given up, and that small movement carried more meaning than anything loud ever could. The puppy slipped past Emily's side then, squeezing through the narrow opening with a familiarity that made it clear this had been his path many times before, his small paws moving quickly across the concrete until he reached the mother, pressing himself gently against her side, his nose nudging her neck in a quiet, urgent rhythm, and for a moment nothing happened, the stillness stretching just long enough to make Emily's breath catch. And then the mother's head shifted, barely, her eyes opening halfway, clouded with exhaustion but still holding that unmistakable awareness, that recognition, not of danger, but of presence. Emily felt something inside her chest tighten at the sight, something she could not push aside with training or logic, because this was not a situation you walked away from. Not anymore, not after being led here with such quiet determination. She moved closer, slowly lowering herself to one knee, her hand resting lightly on the ground to steady herself as she leaned in, careful, deliberate, giving the dog space even as she closed the distance. And she noticed then the details that had been hidden from afar, the way the mother's body was positioned protectively even in her weakened state, the way her front paw rested slightly forward as if guarding something unseen. And when Emily followed that line of instinct, her gaze shifting just a few inches beyond, she saw it. A small bundle tucked against the curve of the mother's side. Another puppy, smaller, quieter, barely moving but still there, still breathing, and the weight of it all hit her in a single, silent wave. "You stayed," Emily murmured, not entirely sure who she was speaking to anymore, the puppy who had come to find her, or the mother who had held on long enough to be found, and the words hung in the air, soft and steady, as if they belonged there. The puppy let out another faint sound, pressing closer to his mother, his tail giving a small, uncertain wag, and Emily reached out carefully this time, her hand hovering just above the mother's shoulder before making contact, light, respectful, letting the dog feel her presence before anything else. And the response was subtle but clear, the tension in the mother's body easing just enough, her breathing shifting, not stronger, but calmer, as if something in her recognized that help had finally arrived. Emily swallowed, her throat tightening unexpectedly as she glanced between them, the small, determined life that had refused to leave, and the quiet strength that had endured in silence. And for a moment the world outside that narrow alley felt very far away, reduced to nothing more than distant noise, because right here, in this hidden pocket of the city, something fragile and real was unfolding, something that did not ask for attention or applause, only for someone to see it and choose not to walk past. She reached for her radio then, her fingers steady despite the emotion building behind her ribs, pressing the button as she kept her voice low and controlled. "Dispatch, this is Officer Carter. I need animal support and a transport unit at my location." She paused briefly, glancing back at the two dogs in the small shape between them, her eyes softening in a way they had not all day. "It is urgent, but calm, no immediate threat, just bring help." And as she released the button, the puppy looked up at her again, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity that felt almost like understanding, and Emily gave the smallest nod in return, as if acknowledging something unspoken, something shared in that moment between a human who had chosen to stop and a creature who had refused to give up until someone did. The minutes that followed did not rush. They stretched, slow and deliberate, as if time itself understood that anything too fast might break what was barely holding together. And Emily stayed exactly where she was, one knee on the cold ground, her presence steady and quiet, her hand resting lightly against the mother dog's shoulder, feeling the faint rhythm of breath beneath her palm, counting it without meaning to. Each inhale a fragile promise that she had not come too late. The alley seemed to shrink around them, the distant sounds of traffic and voices fading into a soft, distant hum, leaving only the subtle details that mattered now. The gentle shift of fur as the puppy pressed closer to his mother, the faint scrape of his tiny claws against concrete, the uneven but persistent rise and fall of a life that refused to let go. "You are okay," Emily whispered, her voice barely more than breath, the words simple but grounded, not a command, not a reassurance she could guarantee, but something steady enough to hold on to in the moment, and the mother's ear flicked again, a small acknowledgement that she was still listening, still present in her own quiet way. Emily glanced once toward the alley entrance, measuring the distance, calculating how long help might take, knowing it could feel like forever when every second mattered, and she adjusted her position slightly, easing closer so that her body shielded them from the faint draft moving through the narrow passage, a small instinctive act that required no thought, only care. The smaller puppy nestled near the mother's side shifted then, just barely, a subtle movement that caught Emily's eye, and she leaned in a little more, her expression softening further as she noticed the tiny chest rising, shallow but steady, and she let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding, a quiet release that seemed to lighten the air just a fraction. The first puppy, the one who had led her here, watched her closely now, his head tilted slightly, his body no longer tense in urgency, but still alert, still waiting. And when Emily met his gaze again, there was something different in it, not desperation anymore, but something calmer, something that almost resembled trust settling into place. "You did good," she said softly, the words slipping out before she could stop them, and the puppy's tail gave the smallest, hesitant wag, as if he understood more than he should. A faint crackle came through her radio then, dispatch confirming that a unit was on the way, the voice steady and routine, but to Emily it sounded like relief wrapped in protocol, and she responded briefly, keeping her tone level, grounded, because that was what she had been trained to do, even when something deeper was moving beneath the surface. She shifted her attention back to the mother, studying her more carefully now, noting the way her body remained curled protectively despite her exhaustion, the way her breathing steadied slightly under a calm presence, and Emily moved her hand just enough to gently brush along the dog's fur, slow, consistent, letting the contact say what words could not. "Hang on," she murmured, the phrase simple but carrying weight, not as a demand, but as a shared agreement, something said between two beings who understood endurance in different ways but met in the same moment. The light above the alley shifted subtly as the sun dipped lower, casting longer shadows along the brick walls, and for a second the scene felt suspended in that soft, fading glow, as if held together by something unseen, something that allowed just enough time for help to arrive. The puppy leaned closer to Emily then, just slightly, his small body pressing against her knee, seeking warmth, reassurance, or maybe simply closeness, and without thinking she lowered her other hand to rest gently against his back, feeling the faint tremor beneath his fur, the quiet evidence of everything he had carried to get here. She did not pull him closer, she did not break the space he chose. She simply stayed, steady, present, a point of calm in a place that had been forgotten until now. And in that stillness, with two small lives holding on and one that had endured longer than it should have needed to, Emily Carter understood something without needing to name it, that sometimes rescue did not begin with action, it began with noticing, with stopping, with choosing not to walk away when something small asked to be seen. And as the distant sound of approaching tires finally reached the edge of the alley, low and steady, she kept her eyes on them, her voice barely above a whisper. "Once more, you are not alone anymore." The sound of tires grew clearer now, rolling slowly over uneven pavement at the mouth of the alley, followed by the faint hum of an engine idling low, steady, controlled, and Emily felt the shift before she saw it. That subtle change in the air when help finally arrives, not loud, not dramatic, just present, and she let out a quiet breath through her nose, her hand still resting gently against the mother dog as if anchoring her to the moment. "You hear that?" she murmured softly, her voice calm, almost reassuring, and though the mother did not lift her head, there was a slight change in her breathing, a steadier rhythm that seemed to answer in its own way. Footsteps followed, measured and quick but not rushed, boots approaching the alley with purpose, and a voice called out from the entrance, low and professional. "Officer Carter?" Emily turned her head slightly, without moving her body, keeping her posture relaxed so the dogs would not feel any sudden shift. "Back here," she replied, her tone even, guiding rather than signaling urgency, because urgency had already passed, what remained now required care. Two figures appeared at the edge of the alley, one in a dark uniform similar to hers, the other in a light jacket with a medical insignia stitched over the chest, both slowing as they took in the scene, their steps instinctively quieter as they approached, as if they understood. Without being told that this was not a situation to disturb too quickly. "Easy," Emily said gently, her eyes flicking up to meet theirs, then back down again. "She is responsive, just very weak. And there is another pup." The medic nodded once, crouching down a few feet away first, giving the mother space, his movements careful, deliberate, his hands visible, calm, and he spoke softly, not to Emily, but to the dog. "Hey there, girl. We are just here to help." His voice low and steady, carrying that same quiet tone Emily had used, and it blended into the space without breaking it. The puppy who had led Emily here stayed close to her knee, watching the newcomers with cautious curiosity, his body still but not afraid. And when the medic shifted slightly closer, the puppy glanced up at Emily as if asking for permission, and she responded with nothing more than a soft nod, a silent reassurance that it was all right. Slowly, gently, the medic reached out, his hand hovering before making contact with the mother's side, feeling the same faint rhythm Emily had been counting, and he exhaled quietly, a sign that what he felt was enough to proceed. "We are going to move her, okay?" he said, more to keep the calm than to inform, and Emily adjusted her position slightly, supporting the mother's shoulder as the medic carefully slid a soft blanket beneath her, inch by inch, making sure nothing was rushed, nothing abrupt, and the mother dog allowed it, her body shifting just enough, her trust now extending beyond Emily to the presence that surrounded her. The smaller puppy was gently gathered as well, lifted with care, and placed securely against the warmth of the blanket, its tiny body barely stirring but steady, and the first puppy let out a soft, relieved sound, pressing closer to Emily before stepping forward again, unwilling to be left behind even for a second. "He stays with them," Emily said quietly, not as a request, but as a simple truth, and the medic gave a brief nod, understanding immediately, making space so the small shepherd could remain near his family. As they lifted the mother together, the movement was slow, synchronized, a quiet coordination that spoke of experience, and Emily kept one hand lightly against the dog until the last possible moment, her touch lingering just long enough to ensure that the calm did not break. The stretcher waited just outside the alley, the soft light of the vehicle casting a warmer glow against the cool tones of the brick, and as they moved toward it, the puppy stayed close, his small paws quick but steady, never straying far, his focus locked on the mother, as if guiding her still, even now. Emily rose to her feet then, her knees stiff from the time spent grounded, but she did not rush after them. She followed at a measured pace, her eyes never leaving the small group as they emerged into the open space. And for the first time since stepping into that alley, the world outside seemed to return, the distant traffic, the fading daylight, the quiet hum of a city that had continued without knowing what had just changed within one narrow passage. The back doors of the transport opened with a soft mechanical sound, and as the mother and the two puppies were carefully placed inside, Emily paused just a few feet away, watching, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying something deeper now, something that had settled there without permission, and as the first puppy turned back toward her one more time before climbing in after them, she gave the smallest nod again, a silent promise that followed him into the light. The doors of the transport closed with a soft, final sound that did not echo. It simply settled into the air like a quiet decision. And for a moment, Emily stood there, watching through the small rear window as the shapes inside adjusted, the medic's steady movements, the blanket shifting gently, the faint outline of the puppy pressing close to the mother, and something in her chest eased just enough to let her breathe a little deeper than she had in the past hour. The engine idled low before rising slightly, and as the vehicle pulled away from the curb, its tires rolling slowly back into the rhythm of the city, Emily did not move right away. She remained where she was, her gaze following until the red brake lights disappeared into the turning traffic, swallowed by distance and routine like everything else in this place. The alley behind her was quiet again when she turned back, the same narrow stretch of concrete and brick, but it no longer felt the same, not empty, not forgotten, just changed, as if something had been lifted from it, something small but significant, and she stepped back toward it for a moment, her boots softer now against the ground, her eyes scanning the space where the pallets had stood, where the shadows had hidden what needed to be seen. And she crouched briefly, her hand brushing lightly over the damp surface where faint paw prints still marked the path that had brought her there. "You did not give up," she said under her breath, not expecting an answer, but feeling the truth of it settle anyway. And then she straightened, adjusting her jacket as the cooler air pressed in again, reminding her that the shift was not over, that the city still needed her in 100 other places, even if this moment had quietly taken something out of her and replaced it with something else. Her radio crackled softly at her shoulder. Another call coming through, routine, measured, the kind of voice that kept everything moving forward, and she responded automatically, her tone steady, her words clear, because that was what she knew how to do. But as she began walking back toward the main street, her pace was different now, not slower, not faster, just more aware, more present in a way that had not been there before. The sky above had shifted into that soft gray blue that comes just before night fully takes over, the streetlights beginning to hum to life one by one, casting warm circles of light onto the pavement. And as Emily stepped back into that glow, she caught herself glancing down more often, noticing the small things she might have missed before, the movement near a doorway, the sound of a distant bark, the subtle signs that something might be asking for attention in a world that rarely stopped to listen. Minutes passed, then more, the rhythm of her patrol settling back into place, the steady cadence of footsteps and observation, until her radio broke through again, this time with a different tone, not urgent, but directed. "Officer Carter, the transport unit has arrived at the clinic. Condition is stable. They are asking if you are available to follow up." And Emily paused mid-step, the words settling into her before she responded, a small silence that stretched just long enough to matter. "Copy that," she said finally, her voice calm but carrying a quiet certainty now. "I will head over." And she turned without hesitation, her path shifting, her focus narrowing toward a destination that had not been part of her route an hour ago. The clinic sat just under a mile away, a modest building tucked between a closed hardware store and a small diner with its lights still on, the kind of place you could pass without noticing unless you were looking for it. And when Emily arrived, the soft glow from inside spilled out onto the sidewalk, warm and steady against the cool evening air. She stepped through the door, the faint scent of antiseptic and clean linens meeting her immediately, a different kind of quiet filling the space, one that held care instead of absence. And as she moved further inside, her eyes found them without effort, the same blanket, now laid across a treatment table, the medic standing nearby, speaking in low tones to a woman in a light blue coat, and beside them, the puppy, still small, still watchful, sitting close, his gaze lifting the moment he saw her. Emily slowed her steps, something in her expression softening in a way she did not try to hide, and as she approached, the puppy stood, his tail giving a small, steady wag, not frantic, not desperate, just certain, and she knelt down once more, meeting him at his level, her hand reaching out without hesitation this time. And when he leaned into it, warm and real, she let it rest there, her fingers pressing gently into his fur, as if confirming that everything that had happened was still here, still holding, still real. The clinic carried a different kind of silence, not empty like the alley, but careful, intentional, filled with quiet movements and low voices that knew how to hold fragile things together. And Emily stayed kneeling for a moment longer than necessary, her hand resting against the puppy's back as he leaned into her touch, his small body warmer now, steadier, the faint tremble from earlier replaced by something calmer, something that felt like relief settling in slowly. And she let herself feel it too, just for a second, before she lifted her gaze toward the table where the mother lay. The veterinarian worked with measured precision, her hands gentle but confident, checking, adjusting, speaking softly to the medic beside her, each word controlled and grounded. And Emily watched the rise and fall of the mother's chest, noticing how it had changed, still slow, still careful, but stronger than before, as if the simple act of being found had shifted something inside her. "She is responding well," the veterinarian said quietly without looking up, her tone steady. She was exhausted, but not beyond recovery. And Emily nodded once, the words landing somewhere deeper than she expected, because they carried more than medical meaning. They carried confirmation that what had been held together by instinct and hope was now supported by something more certain. The smaller puppy lay nestled in a soft towel nearby, monitored but undisturbed, its tiny body curled into itself, breathing lightly, and Emily found herself glancing between the two, tracing the invisible line that connected them, the quiet bond that had kept them alive long enough for this moment to exist. The first puppy, still pressed against her, shifted slightly, his nose brushing against her wrist as if checking that she was still there, and she let out a soft breath, her fingers moving gently through his fur, slower now, more certain, no longer hesitant, because something had already been decided without words. "You stayed with her the whole time, did you not?" she murmured, her voice low, almost thoughtful, and the puppy responded with a small movement, his tail brushing lightly against the floor, not excited, not demanding, just present, just there. Emily rose slowly then, her knees easing back into place as she stepped closer to the table, her eyes meeting the veterinarian's briefly, a silent exchange passing between them, understanding without explanation, and she rested her hand lightly on the edge of the surface, not touching the mother this time, just close enough to remain part of the space, part of the moment. "Will she make it?" Emily asked, her voice steady but quieter than usual, and the veterinarian paused for just a second before answering, her gaze softening slightly as she looked at the dog. "She has a chance, a real one, and sometimes that is all they need." And Emily nodded again, slower this time, letting the words settle, letting them mean something beyond probability. The room shifted subtly as time moved forward, small adjustments, quiet checks, the steady rhythm of care continuing without interruption, and Emily stepped back just enough to take it all in, the warmth of the light, the soft hum of equipment, the presence of people who had chosen to help without question, and in that moment, she felt something she had not expected, not relief alone, but a quiet kind of gratitude, the kind that does not need to be spoken. The puppy moved with her when she stepped back, staying close, his small form shadowing her path instinctively, and she glanced down at him, her expression softening once more, her hand dropping to rest gently on his head, a touch that lingered just a little longer this time. "You are not going anywhere, are you?" she said softly, not really asking, and the puppy looked up at her, his amber eyes steady, clear, holding something simple and unwavering. And for the first time since this began, Emily allowed a faint, quiet smile to touch her lips, not wide, not dramatic, just enough to show that something inside her had shifted too. Outside, the evening deepened, the city continuing its endless motion. But inside that small clinic, time seemed to move differently, slower, kinder, giving space for something fragile to grow stronger. And as Emily stood there, watching, waiting, she understood that this was not the end of what had begun in that narrow alley. It was only the moment where survival turned into something else, something quieter, something that stayed. Time did not rush inside the clinic. It unfolded gently, measured in quiet glances and small changes that only careful eyes would notice, and Emily found herself still there long. After her shift should have pulled her back into the streets, standing near the edge of the room with her arms loosely crossed, not out of habit, but to hold something steady inside her that had not yet settled. The mother dog rested now under soft light, her breathing more even, no longer fighting for each breath, but moving with a fragile rhythm that suggested something had shifted from survival into recovery. And every few minutes the veterinarian would check her again, adjusting a blanket, monitoring without urgency, because urgency had given way to patience. The smaller puppy had been moved closer, wrapped in warmth, its tiny body rising and falling in a way that no longer felt uncertain, and Emily noticed how the space between them had closed, how care had drawn them back together in a quieter, safer way than before. But it was the first puppy who held her attention the most, the one who had refused to leave, the one who had crossed streets and followed footsteps until someone finally listened, and he remained close to her still, as if the path he had chosen earlier had not yet ended, his small form resting near her boots, occasionally lifting his head to check that she had not disappeared. Emily shifted her weight slightly, glancing down at him, and without thinking she lowered herself again, this time more slowly, more willingly, her hand reaching out to rest along his back, feeling the warmth that had replaced the cold she first noticed, and the puppy leaned into her touch without hesitation, his trust no longer tentative, but certain. "You knew," she whispered, her voice softer now, almost reflective, as if speaking to something beyond the moment, and the puppy blinked slowly, his gaze steady, as if the answer did not need to be spoken. Across the room, the veterinarian stepped back from the table, removing her gloves with a quiet motion, her posture relaxing just enough to signal that the most delicate part had passed, and she looked toward Emily with a small nod, the kind that carried meaning without explanation, and Emily returned it, understanding what had not been said, that the line between losing and holding on had been crossed in the direction that mattered. The room seemed warmer then, not because the temperature had changed, but because the tension had eased, replaced by something quieter, something that felt like hope settling into place without needing attention. Emily stood again, slower this time, her movements unhurried, as if she had nowhere else she needed to be, even though she knew that was not entirely true, and she stepped closer to the table, her eyes resting on the mother for a moment longer, noticing how her head had shifted slightly, angled toward where her puppies now lay. Even in rest, even in recovery, that instinct remained, that silent promise of presence that had never left. The puppy at Emily's side followed as she moved, staying within reach, his small paws making soft, steady sounds against the floor, and when she stopped, he stopped too, looking up at her with that same quiet certainty, as if waiting for something more. Emily hesitated for just a second, her gaze lingering on him, and then she reached down, sliding one hand beneath his chest, lifting him gently, carefully, bringing him closer for the first time, and the puppy did not resist. He settled into her hold with a soft exhale, his body relaxing against her as if this, too, was part of the path he had been following all along. She held him there, not tightly, not possessively, just enough to feel the weight of something real, something that had chosen her as much as she had chosen to follow. And as she stood in that quiet room, with the steady hum of care continuing around her, Emily Carter understood something without needing to define it, that sometimes the ones who need saving are not the only ones who are found. And as she looked down at the small life resting against her, she did not ask what would happen next. She simply allowed the moment to exist, whole and quiet, exactly as it was meant to be. The night settled fully outside the clinic windows, turning the glass into a quiet mirror that reflected soft light and still movement within, and Emily remained there longer than she could explain, not because she was required to, but because something in her refused to leave just yet, as if stepping away too soon might break the fragile thread that had been carefully woven through the past hours. The room had grown calmer now, almost still, the kind of stillness that comes not from emptiness, but from things finally being where they are meant to be, and the mother dog rested more deeply, her breathing steady enough to no longer draw constant attention, her body no longer curled tightly against unseen fear, but relaxed just enough to suggest that she felt safe, even in sleep. The smaller puppy remained close to her side, tucked securely, its tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost synchronized with hers, and together they formed a quiet picture of something that had held on just long enough to be given another chance. Emily stood near the edge of that scene, the first puppy still resting gently in her arms, his warmth steady against her, his breathing soft, and even now, no longer driven by urgency, but by something simpler, something that felt like rest, and she looked down at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable at first, then slowly softening into something quieter, something that did not need words. "You brought me there," she said under her breath, her voice low, almost thoughtful, and the puppy shifted slightly, pressing closer, as if the memory of that path still lived somewhere inside him, guiding him even now. The veterinarian approached quietly, her footsteps measured, respectful of the calm that had settled, and she paused beside Emily, her gaze moving from the puppy in her arms to the mother resting nearby, then back again, a small understanding passing between them without explanation. "They are going to need time," she said gently, her tone calm, "but they have it now." And Emily nodded, not immediately, but slowly, as if letting the meaning sink in fully before accepting it. Time. It was such a simple thing, something she moved through every day without noticing, something measured in shifts and calls and routine. But here, in this quiet room, it felt different, heavier, more valuable, something that could change everything if given at the right moment. Emily exhaled softly, her grip on the puppy adjusting just enough to keep him comfortable, and she stepped a little closer to the table, her eyes lingering on the mother once more, noticing how even in rest, her head had turned slightly toward the sound of her puppy's breathing, as if she was still watching, still guarding, even without opening her eyes. She trusted him, Emily said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Enough to let him go find help. And the veterinarian gave a small nod, understanding the weight of that thought, because trust like that was not something given lightly, not even by those who could not speak. The room fell into silence again after that, a comfortable kind this time, one that did not need to be filled, and Emily stood there a while longer, holding the puppy, feeling the rise and fall of his small body, the steady warmth that grounded her in the moment. And for the first time since this had begun, she allowed herself to feel it fully, the quiet shift inside her, the realization that something small and overlooked had changed the course of her day, and maybe more than that. Eventually, she moved toward the door, slow, deliberate, her steps unhurried, and as she reached it, she paused, her hand resting lightly against the frame as she looked back one last time, taking in the soft light, the calm figures, the quiet continuation of care, and she gave the faintest nod, not to anyone in particular, but to the moment itself, as if acknowledging that it had been real, that it had mattered. She stepped outside then, the cool night air meeting her gently, the distant sounds of the city returning in a low, steady rhythm, and she stood there for just a second, breathing it in, before glancing down at the puppy still resting against her, his eyes half closed now, his body completely at ease. "You are not just a stray," she murmured softly, her voice carrying something deeper now, something certain, and the puppy did not move. He simply stayed there, trusting, as if he had always known that someone would finally understand. Emily Carter adjusted her hold slightly and began to walk, not back toward the routine she had left behind, but forward, into something quieter, something she had not planned but could no longer ignore. And as she disappeared into the night with a small life resting against her, the truth remained behind in that softly lit room, unspoken but clear, that sometimes the ones who follow us are not lost at all. They are leading us exactly where we are meant to be.